You're listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, with service members from across the military sharing their stories of combat and survival. And now, here's your host, Mark Zinno.
Welcome into the Hazard Ground Podcast. As always, we appreciate you guys spending some time with us. And before we get into it, I expect to be a very special episode. I want to give you guys just a couple of homework assignments, if you will. One, make sure you guys go rate and review us on iTunes. Good, better, and different. We'd love to hear from you. Love to know what you think of the show. So take some time out. Doesn't take long. Doesn't have to be a long review. Just go give us a review and a rating. Let us know what you think. Also, give us a follow on all the social media sites. We are on Instagram at Hazard Ground Podcast. We are on Twitter at Hazard Ground, and we are also on Facebook at Hazard Ground Podcast. Go to that page, give us a like. You'll get a chance to be updated on everything that we're doing, all the previous guests that we've had, and just get a chance to connect with other veterans who follow the show. So if you guys can do all that stuff for us as soon as you're done listening to this episode, we'd really appreciate it. Joining me now on this episode is somebody that this whole thing doesn't happen without, because really I'm the only other voice other than the guests that you hear, but the man sitting next to me right now is more than half responsible for why this podcast happens every week. He's a close personal friend of mine. We've known each other for nearly 2 decades. We've served together, and he is the voice that you hear over the music coming into this podcast and at the very end of it. He is Matt Pascarella. Matt, fantastic to be here with you as always, but certainly anybody who listens to this podcast, they may not know your face. Obviously, they probably don't know your name, even though it is on everything that we do. You're kind of like the silent partner, but without you, none of this happens. So I thought it was great that we get a chance to spend some time together and talk and let the audience know who you are and how big of a role you play in everything that we do here at the Hazard Ground. But obviously, welcome, brother.
Yeah, thank you, man. I'm glad we finally had a chance to get together, actually in the same location and get this knocked out.
Yeah, it's funny because you and I have been in the works of this. Now, we started this back in January of 2017. But this has been a labor of love for both of us for almost a year, between juggling our careers, families, lives. You have kids, I have kids, and getting everything together. And just, we wanted the launch to be right for everybody. So we spent literally a year talking. And I had approached you with this idea back, I think it was in 2015.
Yeah, it was, summer of 15. I had just moved back to the States from Germany, living overseas for a while. I remember sitting in my car. I literally think we had been on the ground for maybe a week, sitting in the car, just you know what, I'm going to call Mark up. We hadn't talked in a while, catch up with you and see what was going on. And yeah, I remember asking you, I said, hey, we were talking about, sort of career goals and, where we wanted to go with career choices, if you will. And I remember you saying, one thing I really want to do is I want to start a podcast. And right then and there, dude, a light went off in my head. I was like, you know what? So do I. I don't think that at the time the ideas that I had were significantly different in, I guess, content and type of podcast that I wanted to do. But I certainly wanted to do something. Certainly wanted to do it with somebody I knew. So that was perfect. And I was like, I remember saying, I was like, hey man, I'll help you out. Whatever you need me to do, I want to be a part of this.
Well, I could tell our listeners, and again, I said it before, but I'll reiterate it more clearly. This podcast doesn't happen without you. Just the amount of work and the amount of man hours you put in, and in a sense, I kind of get all the glory, if you will, because I'm the voice that people hear. But you do so much legwork behind the scenes. You've done so much for this podcast, and I know, I'm a creative guy. I work inside my head, but you really have kind of put the bricks and laid the foundation down for this thing to be as successful as it's been. And everybody listening out there, bro, this does not happen without you. So everybody listening, you have to know that Matt is critical to the success of everything that we're doing. Some of the biggest guests we've had, Matt has run the ground. Some of the best things that we've done, Matt has been there for all of it. And it's I'm so happy that we're doing this, and I love the work that we do, but just everybody needs to know that without you, none of this is possible, brother.
Yeah, and speaking of, I certainly appreciate that, man. Speaking of creativity, that's, one of the main reasons why I wanted to do this was sort of to take on some more creative pursuits, and you create something that people would actually take something positive from. And, I think we've been fairly successful at doing that so far. a lot of the guests that we have on, I mean, obviously the subject matter is naturally going to be
compelling.
Compelling. It's going to be dark at times. It's going to touch on feelings that people may not have been in touch with, very often. But one of the things we want to do, obviously, is end it on a high note. And we try to do that with every guest, every episode. But yeah, I mean, I've had a blast doing it. It's definitely something that we sort of had it in the incubator for a while. Trying to figure out the right logo, figure out the right content structure. Figuring out how to get in touch with guests. I think that was, obviously Matt Eversman was a huge guest to get on to get started with.
Yeah,
but
he was for those listening, he was our first guest, the guy from Black Hawk Down, the movie.
Yeah, and then from there we kind of, and I remember there just being kind of a lull. Of course, I had some other things going on I was working on as well, so I really couldn't devote a lot of time to setting everything up. But I know that we had that little bit of a lull there, but then going back as far as guests go, when we got in touch with Noah Galloway through a friend of our friend of mine, that's where things kind of just really opened up.
Yeah. Noah Galloway was great. He was our second or third guest. I can't remember.
Yeah.
We've done almost 30 of these things now as the recording of this, and Noah Galloway was the guy in Dancing with the Stars, lost his arm and his leg in Iraq. He's a really notable guy, and his story is fantastic. And it's weird. We've recorded so many of these things, and you do a lot of the legwork and talking to him ahead of time and kind of laying out what the podcast is all about. And, we do the research on these guys and gals and figure out what their story is, their backstory, and try to understand them. So we have a little bit of knowledge going in what to talk to them about. But I have yet to be bored by a story. Like, I have yet to talk to somebody and go like, wow, I'm not locked in on what they're saying, because hearing their stories and just getting them to open up and be raw and honest is something that just happens naturally on the podcast. And I think that's really what draws a lot of people to our podcast, is that, you can get that real emotion.
Yeah, some of the feedback, I've had already. Actually got interestingly enough, I got a note from a guy the other day or last week from Australia, of all places, saying that he was, happy he found the podcast, and he's a former infantryman, Australian infantryman, and was just really, really impressed by the way the show went, how it was produced, and then the conversations and how raw and sometimes emotional they get. He was really, really glad that he found something like that out there. And then another side note too, if you have been interviewed for the podcast, you have talked to Mark, don't worry, we're getting to you. We're getting to releasing your episode.
Yeah. We've got a backlog of, the thing is, it's funny because when we started this, we were worried about not having enough guests.
Yes.
Like, we actually thought we were going to run out of people to talk to.
Yeah.
Which
that was a legitimate
silly.
fear of mine that would keep me up at night. Yes.
In and of itself, when you think about it, how many veterans there are and how many stories that are out there, and how many people don't know. Like, we're never going to run out of guests, but you and I are still constantly searching for stories that are compelling. And, when we started doing this, we literally took 6 months to just record episodes. Yep. Like, we wanted to make sure we had like a 2 or 3 month we knew we were going to release one a week, and we wanted to make sure we had like a 2 or 3 month backlog of guests in case we hit a dry spell that we weren't able to. And now it's gotten to a point where I'm like, Matt, you got to stop loading up like 5 interviews a week. Like, it's real. Like, I don't have the time right now. Like, can I come up for air a little bit? So we chuckle about it, but when we were starting this thing, we didn't know. We knew people would be interested in it. We didn't know how well it was going to take off or what it was going to do. Yeah. And I don't think it's at the level yet that we are hoping for as far as notoriety is concerned. But to continue to do it each week and put out quality product and put out a good podcast that people enjoy, we knew it was going to be a lot of work. So we were worried. Like, we were worried that we were going to somehow not find an interesting story.
Yeah, and now we've had a couple people, and I'm sure there's a few people now that are wondering, hey, when's my episode going to come out? And don't worry, it'll come out.
It will.
We'll let you, and I will let you know that when it's coming out. Give you a heads up. But yeah, we've also had sort of a marketing plan behind that too, a strategy to say, you know, we've got some people that are a little bit more high profile, or they've got a book that's come out that they would like to promote. So we've kind of put those guys or those people up at the front of the list just to get the word out, so that we can have, you know, max listenership for those other episodes that are, you know, people may not know those people as well, and you know, they may. You know, it may not catch their eye when they're scrolling through iTunes or whatever to say, hey, let me check out this episode. So yeah, so there's definitely a strategy behind that. So again, don't worry, your episode's coming out. We're not just going to can it. So, you know, and like I said, I will definitely be in touch before it comes out. So yeah, and so in getting, you know, and that's one of the things that I've enjoyed too, is like, you know, reaching out to a lot of these people. I mean, and listening to the raw interviews, I mean, there's so many stories that are extremely inspirational. I mean, motivating. Again, I was listening to the episode that's coming out on this Tuesday. This is being recorded in July. What's today? The 30th?
30th,
July 30th. So the episode that'll be coming out in 2 days. Bill Reynolds from Vietnam.
Oh yeah,
you know, I mean, like, I was a tearjerker, and I'm not, you know, I'm not that, and people that know me know I'm not that emotional of a guy, and so, but listening to that episode, man, that was some powerful stuff, and you know, just listening to those raw interviews, talking to these guys, or talking to these you know, the guests that we've had on, and prepping them for the episode, you just meet and talk to some fantastic people, and that's one of the things that, you know, keeps me going and doing this.
Yeah, I mean, it's unreal the depths we can get to with certain people, and what they're willing to tell, and you know, how much some of this stuff comes rushing back to them, and that's sometimes for me, as I'm in the moment doing the interview, that catches me off guard. Like, I get caught up in it myself because it's hard not to, and I almost forget that I'm doing an interview. And unfortunately, most of these are done over the phone. But like, there are times where I'm just listening to people talk, and I just want to give somebody a hug. Like, I mean, they really are. You can tell, like, some of the people are really still affected by what's going on.
Yeah.
And
it's understandable.
There's a lot of courage, I think, and I don't want to underscore that, because there's a lot of courage that some of these people have to be able to open up and rehash all those feelings, because it's not comfortable for them.
Right.
Like, that's the one thing we need to remember. I mean, you know, I could talk about my experiences deployed, as you could talk about yours being deployed, and thankfully you and I are you know, relatively the same as when we left, and you know, we got back in the same manner. But for some other people, they don't have that ability. They're not in that position, and I'm never amazed at the level of emotion that people can just get to in having a conversation. And the other thing I think that is part of the whole thing, if they were to talk to somebody who hadn't been there, I don't know that they would have that same level of emotion. I think what's unique about our podcast, and the fact that, you know, when I interview somebody, they know that I have walked the same turf they have. They know that I've been a mile in their shoes, and for that, it's so much easier for them to just be candid and let loose, because I understand everything they're saying.
Yeah.
And it's not something where they have to worry about how to phrase it. They don't have to worry about how it's going to come off sounding. They know the person that they're talking to has experienced a lot of the same emotions. And I really think that taps into a place where you wouldn't get if they were doing like a news story on a local affiliate and telling the same thing, like on an ABC or CBS, whatever it is. I don't think you'd get to that level. One, they don't have the time to do it, because the great thing about our podcast, we can get in depth with people. Like, we're not constrained by 3 minutes of television or 5 minutes of a radio interview. Like, we can talk at length about everything. And so the fact that I can relate to them on that level, they don't really ever hesitate to you know, just let it fly and let loose.
Right. And that's the great thing. I mean, that's the main reason why I wanted to do a podcast. It's one thing I've loved about podcasts since I've, you know, more or less discovered them. I think back in 2010. You know, living in Germany, radio over there is not what it's cracked up to be.
You probably don't have,
it's
other than like disco techno music all night long.
No,
European club music.
You'll get like the middle third of an REO Speedwagon song, you know, like 5 times a day. So listening to radio, you know, I was really at a loss, and I've always loved radio, as you know, kind of in its rawest form. You know, back in growing up in the 80s, 90s, when before radio really got, super corporate and super, clamped down as far as content and programming goes. I've always liked that sort of, like almost like the pirate radio scene. And so podcasts really filled that void for me. And I remember, I think it was like 2010, just discovering them on iTunes and just, going nuts and downloading a bunch of different ones and listening to them in the car, when I'm, driving or working around the house or whatever. So doing this, getting into this was something that I've had, on the brain for a long time. And that's been the beauty of what we've been able to do, is that you literally, and one of the things I tell the guests all the time when, before they come on is, just think of it as a conversation between two vets. It's not your standard interview. I remember reaching out to a couple, high profile individuals and having their secretaries or their publicists get back to me, very concerned about, is this going to be an interview? Is this person going to be, more or less, put in a compromising position or, sort of trapped in some way. And the thing that I have to tell them is, no, to set them at ease, like, no, this is just a conversation. This isn't something where we're trying to get, a major, expose out or anything like that. It's just a conversation between two individuals who experienced something that was very harrowing, that was very life-changing, life-affecting. And, we want to sort of capture, the things that they experienced and the things that they learned coming out of that experience.
And it's funny. I tell them, because when I get on the phone with them right before we start the interview, I kind of just say, hey, here are some ground rules, left and right limits, if you will. And I'm like, hey, it's your story. Tell your story how you want to tell your story.
Yeah.
And I always finish it off with that. It's just two people who wore a uniform sharing stories in a bar over beer. Like, that's really the kind of tone I want to set, and I think that puts them at ease. And most people are, they're pretty genuine about talking about themselves. Like, hey, how are you doing? It's an easy question to answer. So once you get them going and they talk through the beginning stages of their career, and anybody who listens to the podcast who's an avid fan kind of knows we follow the same format. Like, we want to know how they got into the military and how that whole thing started. And some of it we dive a little bit more into their youth and their family and their background and their lifestyle. Some people just say, hey, I'm 18 years old, I enlisted, or after 9/11 I enlisted, whatever it is. But from that standpoint, once, you get into a point where they feel like, okay, this is an easy conversation to have, and I'm just talking with another guy who got in, and I kind of relate some of my experiences with them, then it just becomes easy. Like, then the conversation just starts to flow.
Yeah, and like I said, I think we've lost in a lot of media. We've lost that human connection, and that's one thing that we definitely like to try to capture or recapture. And doing the podcast, again, that's what really drew me into getting involved in doing this in the first place. Even though, again, it wasn't the idea that I had in mind of doing a podcast, but what I wanted to do specifically. But like I said, I've enjoyed it all the way, and I was blown away from day one and listening to that Matt Eversman interview. I remember listening. I think it was like April of 2016 when you actually did it. So we didn't actually release it until almost a year later. So.
And he's just such a genuine guy. I've known Matt for a couple of years. And so he was one of the first people I approached about the podcast, as a matter of fact. Like, when I had the idea, I called up Matt immediately, and I'm like, look, I have this idea, and this is what I want to do. I was wondering if you'd want to help and how you get started, and what can we do. And he loved the idea. I mean, Matt now is like a public speaker. Like, that's part of what he does. So given his experiences in Mogadishu, you can see why he's very good at it. But and if you've heard that first podcast, and if you haven't, go back and listen to it. But Matt, just the words flow for him. But I approached him about it, and I just kind of wanted to know, if I could get the right people involved on the project, then I knew that it would be successful. It would eventually work its way out. As it turns out, you were the right person to get involved with this thing, because you've done so much more work than anybody could ever give you credit for in getting this thing off the ground. But the idea of the podcast, I think I told you this. Like, it just came to me. Like, I think American Sniper had just come out in the movies. And I had read the book, and obviously I read Lone Survivor, and that came out, and there was all these popular stories, and I'm just sitting here thinking, there are so many other stories out there that nobody has ever heard that deserve the same sort of notoriety, that deserve the same sort of publicity. And every now and then you catch them, and some of those guests that we've we've gotten on that have had a little bit of notoriety for their story, whether it's been
Sure.
on evening news
Sure.
or Good Morning America or whatever, and they've had other notoriety for other reasons like Noah Galloway. But I felt like there is so much out there that Americans and the American public can benefit from hearing, and the real human aspects of these things, and
Yeah.
that's kind of why, again, to reiterate, why we got into this whole thing.
Yeah, I remember you talking to John Brankus, who we'll get into the story behind John Brankus here in a little bit, but and why we had him on the show. But I remember you telling him that you were walking down the hallway and
In my armory, yeah. There's in most of the military buildings,
Yep.
they have these heritage painting series that they go all the way back to the Revolutionary War, and even before then. But in the early times of America, Revolutionary War, and even smaller battles like Grenada and the Spanish-American War. But they have all these paintings of everything that the military was involved in. And underneath each painting, there's a little bit of a blurb, a write-up on the whole thing. And so I'd be walking down this long hallway in my armory to get to my office, and I would see all these paintings, and I continued to stop at this particular one from Afghanistan. And it was Operation Anaconda, which was, in early 2002, late 2001.
It was March 2002.
But into 2002, and it was a Battle of Taku Gar. And there is a story of a Air Force commando who basically was saving the life of Rangers who were trapped on the hilltop. And there's a story of Roberts Ridge. Neil Roberts was the first Navy SEAL killed in Afghanistan in the War on Terror. And that's part of the whole Battle of Taku Gar. But there were a bunch of Rangers who went up there to rescue him and get his body and get those guys out of there after a helicopter was shot down. They were stuck on this mountaintop for, I think, about 13 hours in combat.
Yeah, it was a while.
That's how the battle kind of, whole thing went. But the right up underneath there was about this Air Force guy who ended up getting, a Silver Star for saving multiple lives. And I would run by and I'm like, why is this story not being told? And then I went into my computer, and instead of working, I was Googling it. So and I started reading about the whole story, and I'm like, wow, this is insanity. Like, why is this not a movie? Why hasn't anybody made this into a movie? I mean, yes, there are books about it, but why isn't this story out there? Because it should be.
Yeah.
Because I think it's phenomenal, and that's kind of where the idea was born in my head. I'm like, I want to tell this story. I want to tell all these stories because I think they're worthwhile.
Yeah, it's one of those stories. I remember reading the book. I think it was Not a Good Day to Die, about Operation Anaconda back in I think it was like 2008 when that came out. When the book came out, but yeah, I was intrigued by that operation when I read that book, and then I actually studied it or wrote about it or used it as part of my thesis in Marine Corps Command and Staff College of all places. But yeah, that story, Desert One was another one I remember studying in school. That we had Roland Guidry on recently, who was heavily involved in that operation. And by the way, if you were involved in Operation Anaconda and you're listening, or you know somebody that was,
send them our way.
Please send us an email. We're working diligently on trying to get more people from that, or somebody from that. We actually got one guy who we're trying to get lined up. It's been in the works for almost a year now, but hopefully we can get him on because it's got a really good story to tell.
Yeah, we want to get him on before they make the movie about it.
Yes,
we want to be out in front of the movie because
we understand that everyone's got a busy schedule, and people, there's obviously timing conflicts, but yeah. So if you know somebody that's been involved in that operation,
hit us up on any of our social media sites. Go to our Facebook page, shoot us a
do.
message. Just let us know if you have, and that goes for any guest really.
Yeah.
Like if you know anybody who's got a great story about their military experience and about combat and survival, I mean, honestly, just send them our way and get us some contact information. We'll do the research, and we don't really think there are bad stories out there.
Yeah.
It's just some I guess are told better than others, and some stories are, if you have a good storyteller, like it's still good stuff for people to hear. So whatever you guys think of people that you know personally that may have served anywhere, we'd love to hear from you guys.
Yeah. So so there was. That I remember hearing you tell John Brankus about that, and it was actually the first time I'd actually heard you, heard you talk about that. You had the idea from that. I mean, you obviously told me in summer of 2015, that you wanted to do a podcast about this, but I didn't actually know that until I think like a month ago when I heard the Brankus episode. I was listening to the Brankus episode, that I heard.
That was where the idea was born.
Yeah,
that's where it was hatched
Yeah.
inside my little brain. So yeah, that's where we are. And it's funny. I just mentioned about we want to get to stories before the movie comes out. David Williams was one of my absolute favorite guests that we've had, and it was such a good story that we had to break it in two parts because literally I could have talked to him for another hour. I think that the amount of time that we aired was an hour and a half to an hour and 45 minutes, and we broke it up into two different episodes. And I could have talked to him easily for another hour. And the backstory on David, he was one of the first, if not the first pilot shot down in Iraq in 2003. And if you guys remember the Jessica Lynch story, the private who was, the female private who was rescued, forget all the politics behind how all that thing went down, but the 507th maintenance company that she was a part of was a 503rd, 507th or 503rd?
I can't remember.
Anyway, some 50 something, but one of those numbers. Anyway, there were 5 other of her company members who were also captured, and they were separated from her, and they ended up putting 2 more prisoners with them that happened to be David Williams and his co-pilot Ronald Young.
Yep.
And David Williams was the SRO, the senior ranking officer in charge of all 7 of those people. And his story it's just total insanity. They got shot down, but they were able to land. How they tried to evade them on the ground. Yep. Ultimately were captured. They were in captivity for 23 days.
Yep.
They were, blindfolded, put in the back of a vehicle, driven all over Iraq. And it was just, an incredible, harrowing story. And just to hear that, that should be a movie.
Yeah.
That is a movie people would line up to watch.
Yeah, I mean, there's that one.
And David has told us, one of the great things about this podcast, and I'm sorry to cut you off, but, David talked to his co-pilot, Ronald Young, and he was telling me, because we've stayed in contact with some of the guests, and David said, this has kind of sparked my fire to really want to write this book and tell this story again and everything else. And, to us, that's just, if we can be part of that and really help facilitate that, I think that is part of our legacy, as what the podcast does. If we can get people to get their stories onto a bigger platform, that's a win for us.
Yeah, and like I said, I mean, all with the goal of being able to get these stories out there to an even larger audience, whether it's in book form, movie form. Speaking of movies, one of the other ones I'd like to see made into a movie. Actually, 2 of them. And I don't know, there might be a movie out there about this. I know Argo sort of touches on the whole Desert One and
Operation Eagle Claw. Yeah,
a little bit as far as happening. I forget the timing of
concurrently
it,
or the
planning.
After, the planning for Argo. Yeah, because Roland Gage, there were 3 rescue attempts with the Iran hostage crisis. Right. So, and his was the second one that failed spectacularly. But it was going on the same time as Argo was being planned.
Yeah, and then, of course, Will Bardenwerper's book about Saddam and his last days, and the events leading up to his execution. If you haven't listened to that episode, Will Bardenwerper wrote a book. He was an infantry officer, and then after he got out, he actually wrote a book about the guards, the American guards that guarded Saddam after he was captured, leading all the way up to his execution. I mean, they actually shuttled him to the gallows, for his last days on Earth. So that's another one that I think would make an excellent movie and be interesting to see, in another format, another form of media where you can really get that get that experience out there to a much larger audience. And of course, Dale Dye, who we recently had on as well, who's trying to get a movie made right now called
We're going to be in it,
Place
I think.
to Die.
That's what we
cool.
made Dale Dye promise us small roles, so that was his way
Dale,
of
if you're listening,
paying us back. Yes, we're available for auditions immediately.
But yeah, I mean, we've had just those guests that we've had on that have been able to put their story or another story in book form has been incredible as well. We certainly look forward to potentially helping them get those things made or get the word out about anything that they've got that they want to produce or put out there.
Yeah, and just there are some other just great human beings that we've come in contact. Jason Van Camp, just his organization Mission 60. I mean, these are just people who put on a uniform, who've dedicated their life to service, and even though they're not in uniform anymore, they're still going out there every day and trying to make an impact. They're still going out there every day and trying to lead a life of service and help people, and it's just. it's weird because sometimes I sit back and we come in contact with all these people. Johnny Joey Jones is another one.
Yeah.
The Marine who lost both his legs as an EOD tech when he stepped on a landmine. You'll see him on Fox News and everything else, and what he's trying to do as far as making an impact with veterans, and it's unreal. Like some ways I feel like these people have made so much of a grander impact on life than I ever could. It's like, well, all I'm doing is sitting here having a podcast, having a conversation with them, and I know that they think the world of our podcast, otherwise they wouldn't come on it. But it's just they've done so much and they've accomplished so much, and I'm never, cease to be amazed on the impact that they're still having, even given everything that they've been through.
Well, one of the things that's impressed me the most too about a lot of our guests is that they've been able to put, even the ones that are, I'm trying to think if we've had anybody that's still, we've had one that's still active duty, if I recall. But one of the things that everyone's been able to do or does is they put all of their, and as any good, soldier should or does, is put all their political feelings aside, put all that crap aside, and still go out there and try to make a positive impact in their lives and other people's lives. Whether whether they still have all their limbs or whether they're, still, whether they've survived a harrowing incident or not, they're still going out there trying to do something positive. And that's one thing that's impressed me, the most about a lot of our guests that we've had on, especially after going through some of the things that they went through. And you go back to all the way to the Vietnam days. I mean, those guys, a lot of them were just there to serve and do a job. They didn't know what was going on behind the scenes with President Johnson's administration and all that garbage, but they were able to actually just focus on doing their job and keeping each other alive. And that's the thing that, impresses me the most about a lot of these people is that they're still doing that today. They're not going out and saying, oh, well, we shouldn't do this, we shouldn't do that, but they're just out there trying to make a positive impact. And like I said, man, I'm extremely impressed by that behavior. And that
the other thing I'm surprised at, actually, Matt, is that we haven't really run into anybody who's incredibly bitter.
Right.
We haven't run into anybody who, and if they are, unfortunately, we haven't been able to get them on, or they're just not interested in talking. But I'd love to be able to find somebody who's ticked, who's pissed at what's gone on, just because it's a different emotion in the spectrum that we haven't really, touched on. But I think it speaks a lot to the character of the people that we have had on so far, that no one really is bitter about anything that's gone on. Yeah. They just learned to deal with the situation and learn to live their lives and still be productive members of society and all those things, which is obviously great. And some people have had to climb, big mountains to get there within their own lives and fight their own inner demons and turmoil and all that stuff. And, that's also just great to hear that they were able to overcome it and still able to talk about it in a productive manner. But we haven't really found anybody that's like pissed at the world. I could see why a lot of people would be. I think it's fair, and I think anybody listening out there is a rational individual. If you got sent off to war, or even though you volunteered, you went off, to Iraq, and bad stuff happened to you. Nobody would be upset if you were bitter. Nobody would think you're wrong for being bitter. Yeah, and we just haven't come across any of that yet.
Yeah, I think if you look at every war, every conflict, there's always going to be something behind that that's not right, that's not just, and you're gonna, if you're going off to fight, you're gonna feel like, oh well, I've been sent off to do, not a fool's errand, but I've been sent off to do someone else's work that isn't necessarily justified in that situation. But I think Bill Reynolds, who comes out on Tuesday, I think he sort of hit the nail on the head. When he said, "Hey, when I got back from Vietnam, I just wanted to get back. I just wanted to get on with my life. I wanted to get back to life. I had a great car and a great girlfriend to come back to, and that's what I wanted to. I wanted to get back to building my life. And just I didn't want to dwell on what happened in Vietnam. It was an experience that changed me, but I had to find a way to to change for the positive. And when I got back, I just wanted to get on with life. And I remember feeling the same thing when I got back from Iraq in 2005. I was like, what? I just want to. And I remember, I think I, remodeled, half remodeled my fiance at the time's condo when I got back, because I just wanted to get on to doing stuff. I didn't want to dwell on what happened or my experience. I just wanted to get on with life.
When I got back from my first deployment, all I remember is just being paranoid. Like, honestly, like I literally, I carried a knife with me everywhere I went because I didn't have a weapon on me. Like, you got so used to having it on you and being at the ready. My first deployment was vastly different from my second. But I was involved in so much stuff in my first deployment that I just remember being paranoid for like the first 3 or 4 months being back. And I finally went to go talk to somebody, and they had to keep reminding me, you're not in Iraq anymore. Like, you're in the United States. You don't need to carry a weapon with you wherever you go and things of that nature. And it took me much longer to integrate myself back into normal society and decompress from my first deployment. Second one, that's the way I felt. Like, my second one, I just want to get on like a page turn, move forward. I'm just ready to go because, I had a life to live at that point in time. I had a career established in radio and everything else, and I just kind of wanted to get back to all that. Whereas in my first deployment, it was just it was a totally different tenor until I got back in 2006. And but I find that when you talk to people in this podcast and the variety of opinions of people, and we've obviously talked to people who've been part of the same conflict, who have been there at the same time, who've been stationed in the same areas in Iraq or Afghanistan, but it's just a vast variety of opinions that we've come across and feelings and emotions. No two are the same.
Yeah, I think I remember listening to Johnny Joey Jones, having such vivid memories of when he was blown up. And
that was unreal. Like, he could
understanding,
recall
he understood
the smallest
exactly
details.
what was happening when it happened. And mind you, this is a bomb going off under his feet.
Yeah.
And he was able to recall everything that happened and what he needed to do to, take care of himself or get himself, medical attention. And I think it was just amazing, because some guys like Noah Galloway who, was blown up in an IED explosion. Obviously that, he woke up in a hospital later, didn't remember a lot, but it's interesting that juxtaposition of what happens in war and just the violence of it and what happens to some people where they can either remember it or they're completely knocked out and they don't remember it. It's just interesting to hear all those different stories and how people react to them and how they and of course how they come out of it in the end.
Funny that you bring it up because anecdotally, the one thing I've taken away from this podcast that I did not know before, and everybody we've talked to, and Daniel Gade brought this to light. I think Daniel Gade was one of our earlier episodes, like 4th or 5th, whatever it was. He lost his leg in Iraq in an explosion. But every guest has told me this, that whenever a bomb explodes and you start to lose limbs, the one thing and the very first thing every guy asks about isn't, are my legs missing? Is my arm missing? Is my junk okay?
Yep.
Like, that is the one thing. And Daniel Gade tells the story so humorously, like fantastically humorously. So if you really want to get a good laugh or a moment of levity in a serious situation, go back and listen to that episode. But every single person who's been blown up, they've all had to do a junk check. And when you think about it, if you're a guy, and for males listening, like, you can lose a limb. But if that part is damaged, now you're talking about a whole different ballgame. And I did not know that. I did not think about that. Like, I mean, I've been in explosions. I was in a vehicle when an IED went off, but I didn't lose any limbs, obviously. And I just, when I had first heard that, I go, that makes a lot of sense. And now every time, without even asking about it, anybody who's lost a limb, they always tell me, yep, I had to do a junk check, make sure that was okay.
Yeah, I think the military is listened to and providing the groin protector plate. Not that it really does much, or not that anyone has ever actually worn them.
I never wore mine.
I didn't either.
I never put it on. So what we're talking about is with your body armor, the military gives you like this little, like, it's like a triangle thing that hangs down from your waist, and it's supposed to protect your junk.
Just ends up being
as a
flap.
It's just like a flap. It's not bulletproof. It's just supposed to protect like shrapnel that it explodes. It would, prevent it from cutting straight through your man parts. And none of us ever wore it. You just look ridiculous too with it on.
Yeah,
like it wasn't even pleasing to the eye.
It's part of the kit of weighing down a soldier so much that they can't move or be agile if they need to be.
As if the 2 plates that you had to wear and everything else that you were carrying, let's just put more stuff on you.
Yeah.
But they were right. I mean, listen, hey, the junk is important.
That's true. Very true.
So what else you got, brother?
Let's get back to John Brankus real quick.
Okay,
I think, and not just John Brenkus, but Taya Kyle, and Mark Bowden for that matter. Two special guests that we had on, or three special guests that we had on the podcast. One of the things that, and I don't know who came up with the idea. I think you had said, hey, I'm gonna see if Taya Kyle, wife of Chris Kyle, American Sniper,
who's the American Sniper, right?
I'm gonna see if I can get her on the podcast, and that kind of got me thinking. We don't have to just talk to military people, or obviously we want to. That's the nucleus of the podcast is
right.
Have somebody who was in combat, who experienced a harrowing situation and lived through it, and it's about combat and survival, and they talk about that experience. But one of the things we found, starting with Taya Kyle, was, there's these other people that are affiliated with the military in some way, shape, or form, that have an interesting story to tell, that have a story that has a positive outcome, that but took them down a very dark road at some point, but they came out of it, and it's something that people can certainly take something positive from. And getting Taya Kyle, I remember you had sent me a text like, wow, I just got you sent a note to her publicist.
No, it was weird. Like, I just went to her website.
Or the website, yeah.
And like, usually whenever we're trying to hunt down guests, like, the website is the last place to say, hey, contact us, and you get that standard drop-down box.
Right,
What's your message about? Give it to, like,
and we'll never hear from you again.
Yeah, when we don't ever expect to hear back. But I did it anyway. I filled it out. And literally, like, less than an hour later, I got an email back from them saying, yeah, hey, we'll do it. And I was like, whoa. Like, wow. I was like, Kyle's in.
And I remember you thinking, like, how did this doesn't seem right. Like, that was way too quick of a response.
Something's wrong here. Yeah. I wasn't expecting a response that quickly. But I was so excited because, listen, I mean, Taya's story, and if you read the book, and this is the one thing, the movie I don't think does it justice. And we always know the book is better, right? When I read that book, I thought some of the best parts of that book were her thoughts and passages and interjections in the book, because it's where the real emotion came in. Like, the book was written, it wasn't written after Chris died. The book was written while Chris was alive. Chris was part of writing the whole thing. And the author of it, made a point to continually get Taya's input throughout the book. And every time she had a dedicated 3 or 5 pages, whatever it was, 2 or 3 pages, it was just a whole lot of background and emotion that Chris never displayed.
Right.
And I really found that to fill in a lot of holes in this story and really tie the big picture together. And, obviously, the way Chris was killed after everything had happened, and what she must have been feeling and all the like, because you really get a sense, and I don't think the movie does it enough, but literally, like, Taya had given Chris an ultimatum and said, you choose now, the Navy or me. The Navy or your family, and that's it. And she had enough after 5 deployments, as any wife would with kids at home. We need Daddy here. I need my husband back, and that was totally understandable to me. But you don't get that.
One thing I got from that, though, I think she still understood how important it was to Chris.
It was, yeah, but
she could also see that she could also see the toll that was taken on him.
Right, and the book kind of just fills in all that emotion that Chris never really displayed.
Right. And
it gives you a lot, especially when he got back and he was struggling with PTSD and didn't want to admit it and everything else. And the movie touches on that a little bit, but Chris had a hard go of things adjusting back to civilian life again.
Yeah.
Even when he was still in, he had a hard time adjusting back to just being in the rear, being a regular citizen who just happens to be in the Navy every day.
Sure.
So you get all that background. That's kind of what drew me to her. And then obviously you see her on TV and everything, all the stories that she's had to tell and what she's been supporting and this, that, and the other. So I just thought she would have been a different type of guest that really would have served our audience well.
Yeah, and I'll admit that I had preconceived notions of her. Just, I was judging a book by its cover, so to speak, and I really didn't know what to expect with that interview, but I have to tell you, when I listened to the raw interview, I was again blown away. Like, she's an incredible person, an incredibly strong person.
Yes.
We may differ on views, like, political views or philosophical views or whatever, but her as a person, I mean, you really got to the core of who she is as a person, and I have to say, I mean, I was blown away.
Yeah, I mean, the word that always came to my mind when it comes to talking about that interview with Tay was grace. I mean, she was just so graceful. She was so raw and honest, and willing to share stories.
Yep.
And you could tell, like I could just hear over the phone when she would talk about Chris, like, like her heart was warmed. She still loves this man, like, to her core so much. And when she would talk about him, you could just hear it pep up in her voice. And then there were times during that interview, you could hear, like, she was fighting back tears talking to me over the phone. You could tell, like, it was really tugging at her. Yeah. And it was still hard to this day, almost 5 years later, since, coming up this next February, I think it's 5 years since Chris has been killed. It's still hard for her every day, and I respect that. And she was just so willing to talk with us. Yeah. She was just so willing to sit down and have a conversation, one that she's probably had dozens of times before and didn't need to have again. Yeah. It's not like she needs an extra therapy session. Like that's why I felt like Grace was because she was so gracious with her time and willing to just. There was no sugarcoating. It was just her talking to me and telling the story about her husband. And maybe it is cathartic for her. I don't know. I mean,
she's just an incredible person from the standpoint of what she's been through, how she's handled it, and then what she's doing now to help, veteran families or help, I think, public servant families like firefighters and police officers. Mm-hmm. Just the work that she's doing in that arena just speaks volumes for who she is as a person and her character overall.
Yeah, she's another one of my favorites. And anybody who, even if you've seen the movie American Sniper, that's an episode worth listening to, just because you really get a sense of, and I think this is important, like who Chris was.
Yeah.
Because the movie and obviously the book give you an idea, but the way she tells it and the way she talks about him, you feel like you know him. You know, and that to me I think is a great connection to have.
Yeah. Yeah, and Mark Bowden was the same. Somebody who has chronicled the military and done it so well, done the military justice, but also being very fair and objective in doing it, as any good journalist should be. He was another great guy to have on. And again, like going into that interview, I'm like, okay, what are we really going to get out of this? But listening to it again, there was definitely a connection there for who he is as a person, and what he does, what he tries to do. And reading his new book, Way 1968, you really get a sense because again, that was, it's about Vietnam. It's about a very polarizing time in our history. But he handles that with such objectivity. It's, it just speaks volumes for who he is as a person and what he's able to do, again, to tell the military story.
And he has just chronicled some of the most important military moments throughout history. And Black Hawk Down obviously is his claim to fame. I mean, it's what put him on the map. And that became a movie. But beyond that, Mark is incredibly talented, and the accuracy and the detail with which he tells combat stories are remarkable. I don't think there's anybody out there who does it as well as he does.
Yeah.
Not that I've ever read, at least from a newspaper standpoint or a journalism standpoint. Mark is just the gold standard when it comes to that, and he just provides a lot of insight, into the mind of, and it's a general mind, but the mind of soldiers and special operators and things of that nature, and the tasks that they have to undertake, and he understands their mission and their mentality, and is able to kind of give a viewpoint that everybody can understand. Like, he really communicates well to the masses, and that's a tough thing to do when so few people ever put on a uniform.
Yeah, and you listen to him, it sounds like he's actually been in the military and done the things that it sounds like he's done the things that he writes about and is able to talk about them in a very intelligent way.
And that's kind of how, John Brankus came to pass, the guy from Sports Science and ESPN, but his podcast is very similar to ours. Like, our stories are combat and survival, and for the most part, they've all ended on a high note. They all end up with everybody overcoming and landing on their feet and going forward, which is great for them. But, John's podcast is the same thing, except he's doing it with, like, famous people, like actors and athletes and things of that nature, them telling all their stories and personal stories. And, he was really, like, he was a great guy to talk to. I was skeptical about John Brankus. Like, I was like, why are we doing this? Like, I don't have it. I'm not sure where this fits in.
So for the listeners, the story behind getting John Brankus on the show was, I was listening to one of the podcasts I listen to on a regular basis is called Chewing It. It's the two guys from the comedy group Broken Lizard who wrote and starred in the movie Super Troopers. And by the way, Super Troopers 2 is coming out if you're a fan of Super Troopers 1, the first movie. check it out. It should be coming out in about I would say maybe 9 months or so. But anyway, listening to their podcast, and they had John Brinkus on. I don't know how they know John, but they had him on the show, and they got into John's story of how he got into television. The guy grew up in Vienna, Virginia, kind of like where I'm at, in Washington, D.C. area, thousands of miles away, from Hollywood. So didn't really have a connection, but he knew he wanted to get into television and entertainment, right? So he's at the University of Virginia where he went to school, and I think it was Steven Soderbergh who was there at the same time or before him, and he had actually reached out to Soderbergh and said, "Hey, how do I get into this business? I'm like, I'm a million miles away from Hollywood. How do I get into it?" And the advice that Soderbergh gave him, was, if you listen to the episode, he goes into that, like he gave him some, advice I carried, with me to this day, but it essentially helped him launch his career in television. And he, essentially went out, started his own production company. He did all these things, and he's an award-winning producer. And then he got into starting the Brink of Midnight podcast, which he does with his wife. And there's also a good story in there about how he met his wife.
Yeah, very good story.
But just listening to that, I was like, and they try to cover, so they try to do something that's very positive and get a very positive message out, and talking to these guests, mostly celebrities and famous athletes, talking about the moment in their lives that everything changed for them, where everything changed, everything turned, from dark to light, or set them on a path to greatness. So, listening to that, I was like, that's very, that message is something that I think, is great, that needs to be put out more, that people need to hear more of. And although John has no affiliation with the military whatsoever, for whatever reason, I was like, we got to have him on. I don't know, he's a special guest, whatever, bonus episode, whatever. And I remember, thinking like, I kind of got a little nervous as we were leading up to it. Well, first of all, reaching out to him, did the same thing, filled out the little form on the website.
Oh, really?
I'm never gonna.
I didn't know that's how you got him.
Yeah, I'm like, I'm never gonna hear from this guy again. And I think I actually did it twice, and then out of the blue one day, I get an email from, I think it's his publicist, and basically saying, hey, can we do this? How do you want to get set up? Got it all set up, and then it was one of those things where they wanted to get it out, pretty quickly, for whatever reason. And so, so we ended up, putting it out around the 4th of July as a bonus episode. But I remember thinking going into it, I was like, I think I'm going to try to prep Mark for this, but I think it's just going to be, Mark's a sports radio guy. He'll know what to talk about. He'll know what to do. I think when I listened to the Raw interview, I was like, man, this turned out great. Yeah, you did a great job, drawing. Both of you did a great job drawing the parallels between the two podcasts, between the two worlds of the military going through these experiences in combat, and what John does with, because the guests he has on, I remember him talking about, I think it's, I'm trying to remember her last name, but her first name is Scout. She's a Paralympian sprinter.
Yeah, I remember you talking about.
Again, she was plucked out of an orphanage and missing a leg, plucked out of an orphanage in China. Grew up in a family that really didn't support her in what she wanted to do as an athlete, and obviously, and she wasn't even built to be an athlete. That's not her. Like, her body makeup isn't even for that. But she overcame just insurmountable odds to become what she is today, and that was just such an inspiring story, which is very similar. You can draw a lot of parallels between her and the military, and again, what John's doing on his podcast and what we're trying to do.
Yeah, and I love talking to him. He was just so affable, and like he was just down to earth and very just candid and willing to tell his story. And he's just a likable guy. Like,
yeah,
you see the dude on ESPN, and you don't know what you're going to get, but he was a really likable dude. And
a genuine guy too.
Yeah, he's a genuine guy. He's got a great heart, and he was certainly very nice to help promote our podcast. He's got a bigger platform than we do, and that was very nice of him. But there were a lot of similarities. I remember him telling the story about Ryan Leaf, who, the former number 2 overall draft pick, and then he got involved with drugs and everything else, and he got a DUI, and he had this moment that changed his life in prison, and I kind of related it to what Noah Galloway went through when he got thrown in prison.
Yeah.
And he had a DUI. That changed his life for his kids and everything else. And there were so many parallels, as you just mentioned, between stories from our podcast and stories from his podcast. It ended up just being a great marriage together.
Well, yeah, and the moment for Ryan Leaf was his cellmate in prison.
A veteran, yeah, who
was an
veteran
of Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a lot of connective tissue there. A lot of connective tissue.
Yeah, yeah. So it goes without saying that we've enjoyed working with and speaking to every guest that we've had on, whether they've been in the military or not. It's always been a pleasure speaking with these people and working with them. Even if they're, it's difficult to get in touch with them, or once we do get in touch with them, even if we've had to sort of, massage it a little bit to try to get them, on or work schedules or whatever. It's all work, but it's all enjoyable. I mean, for me anyway, it's all enjoyable work.
Oh, absolutely. Doing it. I mean, and contrary to popular belief, we've had people tell us no. Like, we've literally had people say, no, I don't want to be part of it. I'm like, wow, okay. And I mean, I've been caught off guard by some of that. And mostly everybody has been willing to say, yeah, I'd love to be part of this whole thing. I'd love to tell my story. And they certainly appreciate the platform that we're trying to create. The venue and the medium, the driver that we can be to help get veteran stories out there. And but we have run into some people who said no, but they want no part of the hazard ground.
Yeah, we've had we've had two things. One, we've been ghosted by a couple people.
Yep,
not gonna name any names, but a couple people that have said, yeah, I'd love to do it, get ready to schedule, and then
crickets.
just silence. So don't necessarily know what's going on there, but anyway. But we've also had some people too where it's funny because you get these sort of interesting responses that, it's just not going to fit into their schedule, or it's not, they don't do interviews, and it's
not
just
an
like,
interview.
hey, you can tell us no, our feelings are not going to be hurt, you just say no, and we can move on. But yeah, I always thought those are interesting, when we get those responses. But some people too, we've reached out to some people and they've said no, and they've been affiliated with a certain organization, but that organization has been very gracious in saying, hey, this person isn't interested, but we've got these other people, and that's where we've actually found some really good stories and some really good guests through that route too.
Yeah, and we've also uncovered just a number of different organizations that are out there, veterans organizations that are out there, and
sure.
It's crazy that we have so many veterans organizations out there. And I've even mentioned to a couple of them, like, shouldn't we all just band together and make one veterans organization that we all can benefit from? Because it seems like everybody wants a piece of that pie,
right.
To be able to help people. And it's a great thing, but there is a sense of cannibalism from that standpoint where, it's like, which one do you choose? And I can't tell you how many people I have come up to me and say, hey, I want to help out a veterans organization. Which one should I choose? And I'm like, you have got to do your own research. Like, you've got to find one that aligns with the values and the goals that you want and everything else. And, I certainly appreciate everybody who wants to help out, but I've realized through doing this, there are so many organizations out there that are good and beneficial to vets. You kind of have to find one that suits what you are looking for.
Yeah, I think looking at those across the board, there are, like you said, there's a bunch of them that are out there. There's 3 in particular that I can think of that just from working with getting guests through them or getting guests that are affiliated with them. Team RWB, was it Red, White, and Blue, IAVA, and the Greatest Generations Foundation. All 3 of them great organizations, and but getting to work with them, it seems like they obviously have different missions. RWB has their specific mission. IAVA seems to be a little bit more on the working with, advocating for
veterans' rights in Washington.
Right, and being very, very connected to Washington, to Congress. And then the Greatest Generations Foundation, which we were able to get Bill Reynolds through, Vietnam vet, looking to sort of bring to light the stories from the Vietnam era guys and the World War II guys who are still around. Again, all 3 great organizations, and I've had just a great time working with them and seeing how they operate and what they do and learning about them too. Because you've been more in tune, I think, with those organizations than I've ever been. So
Yeah, and there are plenty more. Like I mentioned, Mission 60 before.
Yep.
22 Kills, another one
Yep.
that you'll hear coming up in a future episode. But everyone's out there, and all this just jarred my memory about Nate Boyer. Nate Boyer, who was the Green Beret, who went to University of Texas, and then ended up playing for the Seattle Seahawks for a hot minute, and didn't make the team, but he was in training camp with them for a year, and now he's with MVP, Mets Virgin Players.
Right.
Which is one it's an organization that's out in L.A. Jay Glazer from Fox Sports is part of it.
I believe Ryan Leaf works with them too.
Yeah, Ryan Leaf does a little bit of work with them now that he's out of prison.
Yeah.
But that's another big veterans organization that you'll start to hear about in the coming months. And Nate was a great guest, just incredible story from him.
Yeah.
A guy who ended up in Darfur, for crying out loud, to the Middle East and to the NFL. Just an incredible tale.
Yeah, just another one of those guys that knows no limits. If anything, that one of the messages that we hope we can get across is that you can do anything you want in this life. And you can travel across the world. You can experience the most negative things on this planet, and the most positive, but you don't have to let them ever hold you back from doing what you want to do. And Nate was a great example of that. A guy who said, "Hey, I want to go serve somewhere where I can make an impact," and ends up working with I believe it was an NGO in Darfur.
Mm-hmm.
Had no experience traveling to Africa of all places, and just did it. Figured it out, did it. And he took that same mentality to get into special operations, become a Green Beret. Took that same mentality to play football. Wasn't even again not physically built to play the game at those levels, and did it. And that's that to me, I hope people can listen to these stories and take that message away.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just that's part of the inspirational part of this whole thing that for us is rewarding. We hope for the listeners of the podcast it's rewarding as well, and kind of why we're plugging along and continuing to do what we do every week, just because that's part of that legacy piece I talked about earlier that we hope to leave, that hey, this is a great podcast, and if anything, people listening, you can get a nice little shot of perspective, if you will, on life, because everybody on this podcast has a story that it could always be worse. Like for all the BS that we complain about every day in our everyday lives, and I'm guilty of it too, as many Americans are.
Yeah.
Whether it's bills or struggles at home with family and everything else, and jobs, and man, there's a whole different world out there that presents a whole lot of bigger challenges than what most people are dealing with every day.
Yeah, I know. For me personally, essentially traveling the world, going to the places that I've been to, seeing the things that I've seen, it definitely gives you perspective on what's important in life. And I remember one of the things I first said when I first experienced war was, when I come back, I'm not going to complain about traffic. I mean, obviously I still complain about traffic, but
who doesn't?
But I'm not gonna let it affect me, anymore. And you truly do get that perspective when you come back, that life isn't that bad, and because you've seen what really crappy life is like, and you come back and there's food on the grocery store shelves, everything's stocked, and life really isn't that bad. But yeah, again, it's all on how you get through it, and what you take from it, and what you do in your life when you get back.
And by the way, big shout out to my wife Amanda for coming up with the name of the podcast, Hazard Ground.
That's true.
Yeah, I have to give her a little bit of credit, because I actually went back and I found the email that she sent me with a list of all the names, and Hazard Ground was the very last one. And I remember telling it to you, I'm like, Hazard Ground, I kind of like that. And you're like, I do like that. I really like that. We're gonna do
I know. We struggled to
with
come
the name.
up with
Yeah,
the name.
we struggled big time coming up with the name.
How do we make this? How do we make something that it's gonna catch people's eyes, catch their ears, whatever. But also, we didn't want to be, too in your face, like, this is a military podcast, and didn't want to be too alpha male about it, but also we wanted to be able to, actually have a name that was descriptive enough that people would be like, I wonder what that's about.
Yeah.
So, and all the names we came up with were just like, we couldn't figure it out. And then one day I remember you saying, like, hey, well, what about Hazard Ground? Yeah, Amanda came up with it. I'm like,
she actually gave me a whole list of names, like just a whole bunch of different ones, and so I have to give my wife a little bit of credit, and she's obviously a big support, but
yeah, we got got to give a shout out to Corey at Catatonic, who came up with he came up with our original logo,
Yep.
the one you see on iTunes. He's a great guy. He's a graphic artist, and he does everything from stickers to 3D printed toys to graphics. If you need a logo for anything, he's great to work with. So yeah, definitely shout out to Corey at Catatonic. It's CADATONIC.
And we are getting a website up and going for those who are wondering. We're going to get some swag made, to get some T-shirts or whatever, and all that stuff's in the works as we continue to go forward here and continue to make this podcast something that is a viable product for everybody to continue to stay a part of. So, we hope to continue to grow and expand, and we'll continue to get great guests and continue to put great stories out there for you guys. But all that stuff is still in the works. I mean, this has been a passion project for us. It's been a labor of love, without a doubt, but it's also been extremely rewarding for both of us. And even I mean, I talk to you almost more than I talk to my wife. Like Matt and I literally talk almost daily. If we don't talk, we definitely text something about one or another, and if we haven't gotten sick of each other yet, that's pretty amazing from our part.
Well, it is good that we live in two different cities.
Yeah, we don't ever actually have to see each other all that much,
exactly.
but
we can have a virtual relationship.
When my text shows up, it says Matt. I just put the phone back down. Right? Matt will be there in 10 minutes.
If I don't see those blinking dots within seconds, I get upset.
Yeah, he gets very upset. But no, I mean, listen, man, this has been a blast.
One other thing before we go here,
yeah.
we gotta let the listeners know we are gonna move to a live format here soon.
Oh, very excited about
Facebook
this. Yes.
Live on the Phantom Network.
Yeah, we are extremely excited about this. So you're going to start to see this Hazard Ground podcast in video format in the near future. A buddy of mine in Sports Talk Radio, his name is Ari Temkin. He's got a Facebook Live network that he's created, and he's a fan of the podcast, and he approached me about putting it on, and we connected. Matt and I connected with him, and we're just kind of hashing out all the details still, but that's another way we want to grow this thing. Just start putting it on a network. You'll start to see faces and everything else, and very excited about that big step coming forward. So we have a lot of great things on the horizon for
faces
Ground.
And interact live with the call or with the interview as it's going on. So if you've got a specific question you want to ask, we'll look at potentially taking questions during the interview. Obviously you want to make it interactive for the listeners.
And that's
more than just looking at Mark talk on the phone.
The feedback from you guys is huge, and now that we'll have a way where you can literally interact with the podcast live, I think that's going to be a whole different dimension. Because as brilliant as I can be at times, I know I don't have every single question that people want answered. Because I'm sure people listen, go, I wonder what this, I wonder, and I don't ask the question just because, whatever. But it'll definitely be exciting to get that level of interaction from fans and viewers and things of that nature. Sure. So, but again, it's been a great ride so far. We're certainly going to keep going. Don't know what the final destination is, so to speak, but the journey is kind of where we are, and I'm enjoying every moment of it. And I can't thank you enough again for doing all the work that you do. This podcast is nowhere near as successful as it is without all the hard work you put on behind the scenes. Unfortunately for you, I get to take a lot of the glory from being the voice there, but brother, none of this happens without the work that you've done. I can promise you that.
Thanks, man.
So we appreciate you guys tuning in with us. Check back in next week, back to our regular scheduled programming, if you will, on the Hazard Ground podcast. So for Matt Pascarella, Mark Zinno, thanks for listening, guys.
Thanks, guys.
You've been listening to the Hazard Ground podcast, hosted by Mark Zinno and produced by Matt Pascarella. If you have an interesting story to tell and you'd like to be on the show, send us an email at hazardgroundpodcast@gmail.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.